When Reconstruction ended in 1877, the South entered a new phase of American history. Federal troops left. Reconstruction governments collapsed. Many rights that freed people had gained were pushed back. White Southern politicians celebrated the redemption of their states, which really meant restoring the old political order. But what actually happened to the men who once led the Confederate States during and after the Civil War? Some returned to power almost immediately. Others rebuilt their careers quietly. A few spent the rest of their lives trying to justify their past. Several became national figures again, something that seemed impossible right after the war. This video looks at what happened to the leaders of the former Confederate states once Reconstruction came to an end. The political comeback. The most important thing to understand is that many former Confederate state leaders did not remain out of politics for long. During Reconstruction, federal laws temporarily barred many of them from holding office. But as those restrictions eased, these men returned to government at state and federal levels. By the late 1800s, former Confederate leaders dominated Southern politics again. They became governors, senators, judges, and members of Congress. Their comeback shaped the South for generations. Let's look at what happened to some of the most prominent leaders. Alexander H. Stephens, former Vice President of the Confederacy, leader in Georgia. Alexander Stephens returned to politics surprisingly fast. After spending only a few months in prison, he went home to Georgia and began writing and speaking again. During Reconstruction, he argued fiercely against federal intervention in the South. Once restrictions were lifted, Stephens was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1873. This was a remarkable moment. A man who had served as vice president of a breakaway nation now sat in Congress again. In 1882, he became governor of Georgia. He held the office for only a few months before he died in 1883. Stephens never changed his views about the war. He continued to defend the Confederacy until the end of his life. Wade Hampton III, Confederate general and political leader in South Carolina. Wade Hampton came from one of the wealthiest families in the South. During the war, he served as a cavalry commander. After the war, his wealth was gone, but his influence remained. During Reconstruction, Hampton opposed federal rule. He eventually became the leader of the Redeemers, white Southern politicians who aimed to push out Reconstruction governments. His election as governor of South Carolina in 1876 marked the symbolic end of Reconstruction in the state. Hampton later served in the United States Senate. He was respected by many in the South, but he also supported policies that laid the foundation for segregation and disenfranchisement. His career shows how easily former Confederate leaders returned to positions of power once Reconstruction faltered. John B. Gordon, former Confederate general, key figure in Georgia politics. John Gordon was one of Robert E. Lee's trusted generals. After the war, he entered politics and became one of Georgia's most influential leaders. He served as a U.S. Senator, governor of Georgia, and then a senator again. Gordon was known for his charisma and ability to rally voters. Many historians believe he had ties to the early Ku Klux Klan. Although he denied involvement later in life, Gordon helped shape the political environment that allowed Jim Crow laws to take root. His speeches were popular, and he wrote a memoir that romanticized the Confederacy. James L. Kemper, Confederate General, Governor of Virginia. James Kemper served as a Confederate general and was wounded at Gettysburg during Pickett's charge. After the war, he worked as a lawyer and entered politics. Kemper became governor of Virginia in 1874. His administration focused on rebuilding infrastructure and reducing the debt caused by the war, but he also supported policies that weakened black political participation. After his term, he retired quietly and lived out his later years in relative peace. Joseph E. Brown, former governor of Georgia. Political survivor Joseph Brown is one of the most interesting figures of the era. He had been Georgia's governor during the Civil War. He clashed often with Jefferson Davis and pursued his own ideas about state power. During Reconstruction, he briefly supported cooperation with the Republican Party, which made him unpopular among many white Southerners. But once Reconstruction ended, Brown returned to favor. He became a U.S. Senator and one of the most powerful political figures in Georgia. His ability to shift positions kept him influential long after the war. The lost cause and the rewriting of memory. Many former Confederate leaders spent their later lives shaping the story of the Civil War. They published memoirs, gave speeches, and supported historical societies. They argued that the South had fought for states' rights rather than slavery. They claimed the Confederacy had been noble and misunderstood. This became the basis of the lost cause narrative. It influenced textbooks, memorials, monuments, and public memory across the South. Many leaders used their political power to promote this version of history. Their actions affected how the Civil War was remembered for more than a century. The businessmen and planters. Not all former Confederate state leaders returned to politics. Some focused on business or agriculture, railroads and industry. A number of them invested in railroads. The South's rail network had been destroyed during the war, and rebuilding it created opportunities. Former governors and legislators became executives or board members, planters trying to rebuild. Others returned to plantations that had been damaged or completely ruined. Without enslaved labor, they struggled to make these farms profitable. Some switched to sharecropping or tenant farming. Others abandoned agriculture entirely. Their efforts show how difficult it was to rebuild an economy that had depended on slavery. The men who left the South. A small number of former Confederate leaders left the South after Reconstruction. Some moved west. Others traveled abroad for business or education. A few settled in northern cities where they lived quietly outside the political conflicts of the South. These men rarely spoke about their past. They preferred anonymity over public battles about memory and politics. The leaders who faded away. Not every Confederate leader made a comeback. Some fell into poverty. Others lost influence. A few died young from wounds or illnesses connected to the war. Reconstruction had been harsh on many families. By the time it ended, some leaders lacked the energy or resources to re-enter public life. Their stories remain less known because they left fewer records and played no major role afterward. Reconstruction's long shadow. Even after Reconstruction ended, the political world of the South remained shaped by the war. Former Confederate leaders worked to rebuild a society that was familiar to them. They pushed for new laws that restricted voting rights. They helped shape public institutions and education. Their influence contributed to the rise of segregation in the late 1800s. They played a role in crafting the system, now known as Jim Crow. Understanding what happened to these leaders after Reconstruction helps explain why the South followed the path it did. The veterans movement. Many former Confederate leaders became involved in veterans groups. They attended reunions, organized memorial events, and gave speeches honoring Confederate soldiers. These gatherings created a sense of unity among white Southerners. They also promoted the lost cause, shaping how whole generations understood the war. Some leaders used veterans events to stay relevant. Others used them to pass along their personal version of history. The final years. By the early 1900s, many former Confederate leaders were elderly. They lived long enough to see the rise of new Southern politicians who had not fought in the war. They watched the region industrialize, build new cities, and enter the modern world. Some wrote memoirs in their final years. Others were interviewed by newspapers. A few spent their last years in relative silence. They died in a South that looked different from the world they had grown up in, but still heavily shaped by their choices. After Reconstruction, Confederate state leaders did not vanish. Many returned to power. They shaped laws, rebuilt economies, and influenced how the Civil War was remembered. Some embraced a new era, while others clung to the past. Their decisions had lasting consequences for the South and the entire country. Their stories remind us that defeats in war do not end political influence. Power shifts. Narratives change. People adapt. The end of Reconstruction was not just a political event. It was the beginning of a new chapter shaped by leaders who carried the weight of the Confederacy into the future. Thank you for watching. If you want more videos like this, let us know in the comments. We will see you in the next one.